There are several things the narrator knows about that Friday that the security team, even after reviewing 4 days of footage, never quite managed to piece together. And the most important one has nothing to do with the diamond. It has to do with a conversation that happened 14 days earlier in a federal courthouse on Worth Street in Lower Manhattan, in a room that smelled like old carpet and fluorescent lighting, where a magistrate named Holloway was trying to get through a 3-hour hearing on a disputed estate before his 2 o'clock. The gentleman was seated at the respondent's table. He was not the attorney of record. He had been brought in as a cultural asset consultant by the legal team representing the Osei family, a Ghanaian-American family from the Bronx whose grandmother, Abena Osei, had spent the last 11 years of her life trying to establish that a 34-carat diamond, known in certain circles as the Empress Cut, had been taken from her family's estate in the Gold Coast in 1931 by a British colonial administrator named Geoffrey Hargrove, and that the Hargrove Foundation Gallery in New York City had no legal or moral claim to it. Abena had died before the case concluded. Her granddaughter Yolanda had taken it the rest of the way. The hearing that morning was procedural, an argument over whether certain estate documents from the 1930s would be admissible. The Hargrove Foundation's attorneys, a team from a firm called Pemberton and Ashford that charged rates that made the Osei family's legal costs look like a rounding error, had spent the better part of 2 hours arguing that the documents were improperly authenticated. They were good. They had done this before. The magistrate was leaning toward excluding the documents, and everyone in the room could feel it. At 11:43 in the morning, the gentleman asked to address the court. Magistrate Holloway gave him 90 seconds because he didn't have a choice. What the gentleman said in those 90 seconds was not directed at the magistrate. It was directed with surgical precision at the other table. He said that the procedural arguments were well constructed, which they were, and that Pemberton and Ashford had done an efficient job of burying the substance under the process, which was true, and that he understood why the Hargrove Foundation felt confident the documents would be excluded. And then he said, clearly, for the record, that the Empress Cut would not be in its display case at the Hargrove Foundation Gallery by the close of business on Friday, March 28th. He named the date. He said it the way a person states a fact about the weather, not as a threat, not as a performance, but as information that was simply true, and that the other party deserved to have. Then he sat down. The room took a moment to decide what had just happened. Magistrate Holloway looked at his notes, then at the gentleman, then at the Pemberton and Ashford table, and said that the court did not adjudicate property disputes through improvised declarations, and that they would return to the matter of the authentication documents. One of the Pemberton attorneys was already typing. The other was watching the gentleman with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to something more careful. The hearing concluded 40 minutes later. The documents were excluded. Yolanda Osei, seated in the gallery, said nothing. She had attended every session of this case for 3 years, and she had learned when to be still. The gentleman gathered his materials, buttoned his jacket, and walked out through the lobby of the courthouse onto Worth Street, where the March air was thin and cold, and the traffic on Center Street moved in the direction of everything that didn't care about 1931. He had made the promise. Now he had to keep it. If you're the kind of person who follows through on commitments that most people would quietly let expire, you already understand something essential about what comes next. If you're not sure, stay with this story, because that question is going to come back around before the end. And if you want more stories like this one, about people who operate by a code that was never printed in any rulebook, the subscribe button is right there. This channel is for the kind of listener who asks how, not just what. The Hargrove family had been in New York for 4 generations, which in certain rooms meant something and in other rooms meant everything. The foundation had been established in 1978 by Cornelius Hargrove, grandson of Jeffrey, as a tax-efficient vehicle for what the family described as cultural stewardship, and what a more skeptical reading might describe as a method of holding on to things that had been acquired under circumstances that did not bear close examination. The foundation owned 11 significant pieces, paintings, sculptures, a small collection of pre-Columbian objects, and the Empress cut. The diamond was the crown of the collection, literally and symbolically. It had been appraised most recently at $4.3 million, and it had been insured for considerably more. The gallery itself occupied the ground floor and mezzanine of a building on East 70th Street, 2 blocks off Fifth Avenue, in the kind of neighborhood where the buildings have names and the doormen know the difference between someone who belongs and someone who thinks they do. The Hargrove Foundation Gallery had been a fixture there for 30 years. It received grants. It hosted private dinners. It had a gift shop with tasteful reproductions. It was the kind of institution that felt permanent because it had learned to make permanence look like culture. The Empress cut occupied a custom display case in the center of the main gallery floor, mounted on a plinth of black granite, sealed under museum-quality glass, and protected by a pressure sensor built into the base that would trigger both a local alarm and a silent signal to the security firm's monitoring center if the weight on the plinth changed by more than 2 grams in either direction. The display case itself was alarmed separately. The motion sensors in the gallery covered every approach. The conservation wing behind the main gallery floor, where the most sensitive pieces were stored, and where the Empress cut had once been kept before the foundation decided that visibility was better than privacy, was protected by biometric access, a palm scanner that logged every entry and exit, with a record that went back 4 years. The firm handling security was called Garrison Group. They ran rotating 6-person shifts. The team knew the building the way people know buildings they've worked in for years. Not completely, but with the comfortable confidence of people who have never had a reason to look for the gaps. When the Pemberton attorneys got back to their offices and briefed the foundation's director, a man named Prescott Hargrove, who was Cornelius's son and who had been running the foundation for 11 years, the reaction moved through several stages. There was dismissal. Then there was a meeting. Then there was a phone call to Garrison Group. By the end of the day, following the courthouse hearing, Garrison Group had been authorized to double its team. 6-person shifts became 12. 2 additional camera systems were ordered and installed by Thursday of that week, one covering the Empress cut specifically, one providing a wider field of view across the entire main gallery floor. The pressure sensor was tested and recalibrated. The biometric system was audited. The perimeter alarm was checked. Prescott Hargrove also called his attorneys. The attorneys told him that the statement in the courthouse was almost certainly theater, a pressure tactic, an attempt to rattle them before the next hearing. They said it was the kind of thing people did when they were losing on the documents and needed to create noise. They were experienced people, and they had seen noise before, and they were not wrong about any of the tactical analysis. What they didn't know, and what the gentleman had counted on them not knowing, was that he had been inside the building for 6 weeks. The insurance revaluation had been the foundation's idea. Their existing policy was due for renewal, and the insurer, a specialty firm that handled high-value cultural assets, had required an independent assessment of the collection before extending coverage. The foundation had reached out to several consultants. The gentleman had come recommended by a cultural asset advisory firm that was legitimate in every respect that mattered. His credentials had been reviewed. His background had been checked. He had been issued a building access card that got him through the front door and into the administrative wing and into the conservation area, which shared a corridor with the back of the main gallery. And he had spent 6 weeks doing exactly what he had been hired to do: reviewing documentation, examining pieces, cross-referencing provenance records, producing a draft assessment that was thorough and professional, and that the Foundation's board had reviewed and considered credible. He had also spent 6 weeks learning the building. There is a specific kind of attention that looks like routine. The consultant who arrives at the same time 3 mornings a week and takes the same route to the archive room and asks the same kind of questions and stops to look at his notes in the same hallway at approximately the same time. That person is invisible. Not because nobody sees him, but because he looks like what he is supposed to look like, and what he is supposed to look like is someone doing a job. In environments where security is built around physical barriers and electronic systems, the human beings who move through those environments without triggering any of those barriers or systems are close to transparent. The gentleman had noted during those 6 weeks that the corridor connecting the administrative wing to the back of the main gallery floor had a door that was alarmed on the gallery side and not on the administrative side. The alarm was a legacy system installed before the most recent renovation that the security team had incorporated into their rounds without anyone questioning whether the logic of it still made sense. He had noted that the conservation wing's palm scanner logged entries and exits, but that the log was reviewed only when there was an incident, not routinely, not proactively. He had noted that the freight elevator that served the building's basement was used twice a week for supply deliveries, and that the camera covering the freight area had a field of view that the delivery staging alcove fell just outside of. He had noted the shift change times. He had noted which guards ate lunch in the break room and which ones ate at the desk near the front entrance, and which one, a contractor named Phil, who had been pulled in from a different account to cover the staffing gap, always spent the first 20 minutes of his shift doing a walk of the perimeter in a pattern that was consistent to within about 4 minutes. He had not done anything with any of this. He had written it down in a notebook that looked like a work notebook because it was a work notebook, in among the provenance notes and the appraisal comparables and the assessment drafts, and he had closed the notebook and gone back to his work. He had submitted the insurance assessment 2 weeks before the hearing on Worth Street. The Foundation had paid his invoice. He no longer had an access card. Now here is the thing about what Garrison Group did when they doubled their team. They needed bodies, and they needed them fast, and the approved vendor list for emergency contractor staffing ran through a workforce management platform that the Hargrove Foundation's HR department used for all their contract personnel. The system had been part of the Foundation's administrative infrastructure for 3 years. During the insurance revaluation, the gentleman had reviewed the Foundation's administrative records as part of the asset documentation process, and the workforce management platform had been one of the systems whose access credentials had been available to him in the normal course of that work. Because the platform held records related to contractor insurance certificates, and insurance certificates were relevant to the assessment. He had not done anything with that access at the time. Ask yourself something, genuinely. If you watch someone spend 6 weeks in a building doing a job they were hired to do, leaving every day, submitting their work on time, collecting their payment and departing, would you think to look back at that person when something went wrong 2 weeks after they left? Would the thought even occur to you? The emergency contractor vetting process ran through the platform, Garrison Group submitted names. The platform processed them. The platform's activity logs were not monitored in real time. By the Tuesday of the week before March 28th, the expanded security team was in place. 12 guards, 2 new camera systems, a recalibrated pressure sensor, a tested biometric lock. Prescott Hargrove had been briefed on every measure. His attorneys had been briefed. The Foundation's board had received an update. The consensus across all of those conversations was that the statement from the courthouse had been adequately addressed. A man had announced he was going to take a 34-carat diamond from one of the most secured small galleries in New York City in 14 days, and they had responded by making that gallery significantly more secure. The math seemed to work in their favor. The gentleman spent that Tuesday at a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue reading about the 1931 administrative records of the Gold Coast Secretariat, which were partially digitized and partially available through a university archive in Accra that had been working on a digitization project for several years. He was not doing this for the case, which had lost its evidentiary footing when the documents were excluded. He was doing it because the story was worth knowing. Abena Osi had known it her whole life. Her granddaughter Yolanda knew it. It seemed reasonable that at least one other person who was about to do something relevant should know it too. On Wednesday, he had lunch with a man named Terrell Brooks, who had worked freight logistics for a mid-size art handling company for 11 years, and who had, at various points in the past, worked with the gentleman on matters that were never written down anywhere. Terrell ordered the soup. They talked about a delivery schedule. They talked about a staging alcove. They talked about the specific dimensions of a shipping container, rated for temperature-sensitive materials. The conversation took 45 minutes. Terrell left a 20 on the table. On Thursday, the gentleman went to see a woman named Isabel Reyes, who ran a document authentication service out of an office in Midtown that did work for galleries, auction houses, and occasionally law firms. Isabel was precise and methodical, and she had the specific kind of professional ethics that meant she asked exactly the questions that were in front of her, and not the ones that weren't. They discussed a provenance chain. They discussed what authenticated documentation of a 1931 transfer of property would look like if it existed, and where the most reliable archive sources for that period and that region would be. Isabel sent him 3 references by email that evening. He read them that night. Friday came. The morning shift at the Hargrove Foundation Gallery began at 7. The expanded team did their sweep. The Empress cut was in its case. The pressure sensor read normal. The cameras were running. Phil did his perimeter walk, same route, same 20 minutes, same 4-minute variance. The morning passed without incident. The afternoon shift arrived at 1. They were briefed by the outgoing team. Nothing to report. The gallery opened to the public at 10 and closed at 5. And on Fridays, it occasionally ran a little long because the last admission was 4:30, and sometimes visitors lingered. The team was thorough. They were professional. They had been told that something was supposed to happen today, and they were paying attention, which meant they were watching the things they knew to watch. What happened in the freight area of the building at 2:17 in the afternoon was logged by the building's access system as a routine delivery. The temperature-controlled container was signed in by the building's receiving clerk, a part-time employee named Gary who worked Tuesdays and Fridays and who had processed dozens of similar deliveries for the gallery. The container was moved to the staging alcove. The staging alcove was outside the camera's field of view by about 2 feet. At 2:41, Phil began his walk. At 3:08, the afternoon shift lead did his second full sweep of the main gallery floor. The Empress cut was in its case. He noted it in his log. At 4:52, the last visitor exited the gallery. The front entrance was secured. At 5:31, the closing team did the end-of-day check. The Empress Cut's display case was sealed, alarmed, and locked. The pressure sensor read normal. The weight on the plinth was within tolerance. What was on the plinth, sitting in the exact geometry of where the Empress Cut had rested for 11 years, weighted to within 1 gram of the diamond's recorded mass, was a piece of cut and polished optical glass. They found this out at 5:44 when one of the guards noticed that the light coming through the case was behaving differently than it usually did and called the shift lead over. And the shift lead looked at the case for a long time before he picked up the phone. Prescott Hargrove arrived at the gallery at 6:15. He stood in front of the case for a long time. The glass replica sat on the black granite plinth in the exact position the diamond had occupied. It had been cut well. In certain light, from a certain angle, it was convincing. Taped to the inside surface of the display case's glass, on the interior, which meant it had been placed there before the case was sealed, was a card. The card had been printed on good paper. It said 4 words. For the record, that was all. The lawyers were called. Garrison Group's director was called. The police were called. The cameras were reviewed. All of them, including the 2 new systems that had been installed specifically for this contingency. The footage showed the gallery floor, the display case, the guards making their rounds, the visitors moving through the space. It showed everything the cameras were pointed at. It did not show anything that explained what was now sitting on the plinth in the place of a 34-carat diamond worth $4.3 million. The pressure sensor had never triggered. The alarms had not sounded. The biometric log showed authorized entries and exits. The perimeter had not been breached. The doubled security team had been present and functional for the entire day. The investigation that followed lasted 11 days. Garrison Group's director later said, in a conversation that was not on the record, that it was the most complete non-event he had ever been asked to explain. Every system had worked. Every person had done their job. Something had happened anyway, and the cameras had recorded every inch of the building, and nobody could identify what they were supposed to be looking for. The police opened a case. The case remained open. Prescott Hargrove did not speak publicly about what had happened. He had been advised not to. His attorneys had been advised that the optics of publicizing the theft of a piece whose ownership was the subject of active litigation were not straightforward. Explaining to a reporter that the Empress Cut had been taken would require explaining what the Empress Cut was, which would require explaining the Osei case, which would require explaining 1931. And none of those conversations ended in a place that was good for the foundation. So the case sat in police records, and the gallery put a different piece on the plinth. And the foundation's insurance claim entered a process that was going to take a long time and involve questions about provenance that the foundation's attorneys were not eager to have asked. The calling card, 4 words, printed on good paper, taped to the inside of a locked display case that had never triggered an alarm, became the only public fact about the incident that anyone outside the investigation knew about, and only because one of the responding officers had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. For the record, the phrase appeared once in a local blog that covered art world news attributed to an anonymous source, and the foundation's communications team made one call and it disappeared. Yolanda Osei heard about what had happened through a contact she wouldn't identify to anyone. She was sitting in the kitchen of her apartment in the Bronx, where her grandmother had lived for the last 18 years of her life, and where Yolanda had grown up, and she was quiet for a long time. She didn't ask how. She had the understanding that certain questions were not the right questions. She thought about her grandmother, who had carried a specific piece of knowledge across an ocean and through a lifetime, and all the way to a federal courthouse. And she thought about what it meant that the thing her grandmother had described was no longer sitting in a case on East 70th Street. She couldn't use it. Whatever had not happened through any legal channel she was party to. And whatever had been removed from that gallery was not going to materialize in her possession. That was not the point. She understood that. The point was something else. And it was something she felt in her chest in the kitchen that night, while the traffic on the Grand Concourse went by outside, and she didn't have a word for it, but it felt like being seen. The gentleman was not in New York when the police started interviewing people. He had checked out of his hotel on the morning of the 28th before the gallery opened and had taken a flight that afternoon. He did not contact Yolanda Osei directly. He had no way of knowing with certainty what she felt in her kitchen that night, though he had made a reasonable inference about it when he sat with the decision, months before, about whether to make the promise at all. The question of why he had announced it in open court, why he had put himself on the record in the most literal possible way, was the one that people who knew pieces of the story kept coming back to. The practical argument for silence was obvious. The practical argument for the announcement was less obvious until you understood the specific nature of what the Hargrove Foundation had done to the Osei case. The documents had been excluded. The legal path had been closed. The mechanism that was supposed to adjudicate this kind of claim had been captured by the people who benefited from the outcome. In that environment, the only record that couldn't be suppressed or excluded or buried in emotion was one that was already typed into the transcript of a federal hearing. The announcement was the only part of this that was truly permanent. He had made the promise because keeping it was the only way to honor what Abena Osei had spent 11 years trying to do through channels that were supposed to work and didn't. The cost of making that promise in front of a magistrate and 2 rows of Pemberton attorneys was that he had to keep it regardless of what it required. He had understood that when he said the words, he had said them anyway. There is a specific weight to a commitment made in public, to people who are certain you won't follow through. It is heavier than a private promise because the private promise can always be forgotten by everyone involved and quietly renegotiated. The public one is in the record. You either keep it or you don't, and everyone knows which one you did. Most people, when they feel that weight, choose not to make the promise in the first place. They stay quiet. They stay strategic. They manage their exposure. There is nothing wrong with that. But there is something that happens in the room when someone makes the promise anyway, when they say the thing out loud, in the presence of the people who most need to hear it said, that no amount of strategic silence can produce. Prescott Hargrove had felt it at that table. His attorneys had felt it. Magistrate Holloway had felt it, which was why he had looked up from his notes. What Yolanda Osei had felt, hearing it from the gallery seats, was something different. It was the first time in 3 years of hearings that someone on her side of the table had said something that wasn't a response to what the other side had already done. It was the first move that belonged entirely to them. The gentleman had thought about that moment, that specific shift in the room, more than he had thought about the Friday itself. The Friday was a problem to be solved, and he was good at solving problems. What happened in the courthouse on Worth Street was something else. It was the decision that made everything else necessary. And it was the decision that had no contingency plan, because the only contingency for a public promise is to keep it. He did not feel, in the weeks that followed, the particular kind of satisfaction that comes from a clean outcome with no complications. He felt something quieter than that. The specific quality of having done the thing he said he would do, which is less like satisfaction and more like the absence of a weight you have been carrying long enough that you stopped noticing it. He had made a commitment in a room where it cost something to make it. He had kept it. That was the whole of it. What he thought about sometimes was Terrell Brooks, who had ordered the soup and left the 20 and never asked a question he didn't need the answer to. And he thought about Isabel Reyes, who had sent him 3 archive references and trusted that the purpose was what it appeared to be. These were people who had extended credit, not financial credit, but the kind that matters more and gets repaid differently. You don't repay that credit with money. You repay it by being the kind of person who deserved it when they extended it. That accountability was part of the code, the same way the promise in the courthouse had been part of the code. You make the commitment, and then you become the person who kept it. And those two things are not separable. Somewhere in the Hargrove Foundation Gallery, a different piece occupied the black granite plinth. The insurance claim was working its way through a process that asked, among other things, for documentation of the piece's acquisition history. That process was going to take a long time. The Osei family's attorneys had filed a new motion based on a line of argument that didn't depend on the excluded documents. Whether it would succeed or not was in the hands of people and systems that the gentleman had no control over. He had done what he could do, through the means he had. The 4 words on the card were still in the transcript of someone's mind. For the record. Precise, economical, final. The kind of statement that doesn't need anything added to it. You stayed with this story until the end, which means you understand something about what it costs to mean what you say. The gentleman didn't make that promise because it was easy or because he had a guaranteed exit. He made it because not making it would have been its own kind of answer, and he wasn't willing to give that answer in that room, to those people, about that particular piece of history. The cleanest promises are the ones nobody witnesses, but the ones that matter are the ones you make out loud, when it's inconvenient. When the other side is already writing down how you're going to fail. If this story resonated, a like and a subscription keep this channel running, and they take about 4 seconds, which is a reasonable price for however long you've been here. Every episode on this channel is about someone who operates by a code that the official rules never quite captured. This is not the last story like this one. Here is the question to take with you. Is there something you said you would do, out loud to someone who needed to hear it, that you've been finding reasons to delay? What would it change about you and about them if you stopped delaying? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. The gentleman knew that. He asked it of himself once, and it pointed straight at a courtroom on Worth Street. He went anyway.